The minutes stretched on in a quiet tension as they re-entered the event. Maximilian could still feel the warmth of Christian's presence lingering, the unsaid words, the silent understanding between them. His heart beat in uneven rhythms, betraying the calm he tried to project. Inside, the noise of the crowd surrounded him, the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. But it all felt distant. His mind was stuck on the moment they'd shared outside, on the way Christian had looked at him, as though the world could melt away in a single glance. Alan caught his eye from across the room, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You two good now?" he asked, his tone dripping with amusement. Maximilian didn't answer, only made his way toward the far side of the room, where a small group of his father's associates stood, chatting idly. As he approached, their conversations halted, the air thickening with expectations. He was the only son of a respected judge, and his presence was a symbol of power, of authority, but no one ever seemed to see the man beneath the title. It was always the heir, always the role he was supposed to play. Christian remained close behind, his silent vigilance making Maximilian aware of every movement, every shift in the air. There was something strange about how it made him feel, something unsettling, yet strangely reassuring. The evening stretched on, the words from the meeting blurring into background noise as his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation they'd shared, to the way Christian had looked at him, the way his presence felt undeniable, even when Maximilian had tried to push it away. He couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. That much was clear. As the evening wore on, Maximilian grew increasingly restless. The air felt heavy with all the unspoken words between them, with the tension that kept building despite his best efforts to ignore it. And then, unexpectedly, Christian moved closer, his hand brushing against Maximilian's elbow in a gesture so casual it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But it didn't go unnoticed to him. "Everything all right?" Christian asked, his voice soft, but with an underlying firmness that made Maximilian's heart race. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, his gaze flicking away, unwilling to look him in the eye. But Christian didn't pull away. He stood there watching him closely, as if waiting for something. For what? Maximilian wasn't sure. "Your father's waiting for you," Christian said quietly, breaking the silence. "Let's get through this, and then we can talk." Maximilian's breath caught for a second, something flickering in his chest, an uncertainty he couldn't shake. He wanted to argue, to push back, to demand space, but the words felt hollow. He couldn't pretend anymore. Not with Christian standing this close, not with the way he was looking at him. With a sigh, he nodded and moved forward, Christian following closely behind, like an unshakable shadow. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of formalities. Maximilian smiled and nodded at the right times, shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the quiet presence behind him, the steady watchfulness of Christian, who followed him everywhere. He felt Christian's gaze even when he wasn't looking directly at him, a weight on his back that he couldn't escape. As the evening drew to a close, Maximilian found himself standing by the window, watching the last of the guests trickle out of the venue. The room had quieted down, the lively chatter fading into hushed murmurs. He longed to escape, to be alone for just a moment, but something kept pulling him back. Christian appeared beside him, his posture still as composed as ever. "It's over," he said simply, but there was an edge to his voice, something deeper that Maximilian couldn't ignore. "Yeah," Maximilian replied, his voice distant. "I guess it is." They stood there in silence for a long while, the quiet between them thick with unspoken words. Maximilian felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the tension between them that refused to dissipate. He could feel Christian's presence, as if it were an extension of his own. "Do you ever wonder why you're here?" Maximilian asked abruptly, his voice low. He didn't mean for the question to come out like that, but once it was out, it hung in the air, impossible to take back. Christian didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to Maximilian, his gaze intense, searching. "Why do you think I'm here?" His voice was calm, but there was a question in his tone that felt almost like a challenge. Maximilian turned away, looking back out at the city. "To protect me, I know," he said with a forced nonchalance. "That's your job." Christian stepped closer, his footsteps soft against the floor, but his presence felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. "That's part of it," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "But it's not the whole story." Maximilian's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to know. But the curiosity was too strong. "Then what's the rest of the story?" Christian's eyes held his for a long moment, and for a split second, Maximilian thought he saw something else in them, something deeper, more complicated than the usual professional distance. It was an emotion he couldn't quite place, one that made the air between them feel charged, like a spark waiting to ignite. "The rest of the story," Christian began slowly, his voice low, "is that you're not the only one trapped in this world." Maximilian's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, Christian continued. "I'm not here just because your father hired me. I'm here because I made a choice to be here. And maybe, just maybe, there's more to this than just protection." Maximilian's breath caught in his throat, his pulse quickening. The words hung in the air like a confession, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the situation, the pull between them that neither of them had acknowledged. "You didn't have to do this," Maximilian said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face Christian, his eyes searching his expression. "You could have stayed away." Christian took another step closer, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them had faded into nothing. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply, his voice raw with a sincerity that left Maximilian breathless. "Not when I knew you needed someone to see you. Not just the heir, not just the son of the judge. But you." Maximilian felt a rush of emotions, the walls he'd built starting to crumble, bit by bit. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to understand, but all the words seemed to fall short. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Christian was so close now, close enough that Maximilian could feel the heat of his body, close enough that the air between them felt electric. His chest tightened, the words on the tip of his tongue, but he didn't know how to voice what he was feeling. Maximilian felt seen, and it scared him more than he could explain. Christian, seeming to sense his hesitation, finally spoke again, his voice soft, almost tentative. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Maximilian. Not now. But I won't walk away either. Not unless you push me away." Maximilian swallowed hard, his heart racing. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the unspoken invitation that hung between them. But he didn't push him away. Instead, he stood there, facing Christian, the two of them locked in a moment of raw vulnerability, neither of them willing to break the connection. Maximilian knew that things had changed. Something had shifted between them, and there was no going back. The question was, would he allow it to happen? Maximilian stood frozen, every fiber of his being torn between instinct and something deeper, something unfamiliar. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken tension, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Christian was close, too close, and yet there was a distance between them that neither could bridge. Not yet. Christian's steady gaze never wavered, his presence solid and unwavering. The warmth of his proximity seemed to draw Maximilian in, his pulse quickening with every second that passed. He wanted to pull away, wanted to push Christian out of his space, but the thought of being left alone again, truly alone, made him hesitate. "I don't know what to do with this," Maximilian finally said, his voice tight. His eyes flicked away, his heart racing as he searched for something, some clarity, amidst the chaos of his feelings. Christian took a breath, his eyes softening ever so slightly. "You don't have to know everything right now." He stepped back, just enough to give Maximilian a little breathing room, though the tension between them remained. "But you don't have to figure it all out alone either." Maximilian clenched his fists, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I've been alone my whole life," he muttered under his breath, not expecting Christian to hear. But Christian did, and the soft flicker of understanding in his eyes was unmistakable. "You're not alone anymore," Christian said simply. "Not if you don't want to be." Maximilian felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed over the years. The walls he had built, brick by brick, had always kept people at a distance. But Christian had been different. From the very start, he had been different. And now, standing here, with those words hanging in the air, Maximilian realized he had no idea how to deal with the storm brewing inside him. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, more to himself than to Christian. "I don't know how to let someone in." Christian didn't hesitate. He stepped closer again, his presence like a steady anchor. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Maximilian," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to trust me." Maximilian's breath hitched in his chest. The idea of trusting someone, of truly trusting someone, was terrifying. But in that moment, he realized how much he wanted to, how much he needed to. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Christian's gaze was unwavering, and Maximilian felt the weight of his words settle over him, heavy and real. He didn't know what the future held, or if he was even ready for whatever this was between them. "You're not going to leave, are you?" Maximilian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if it was a question or a plea. Christian shook his head, the slightest of smiles tugging at his lips. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, his hand brushing against Maximilian's arm in a gesture that felt oddly intimate. Maximilian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything, the pressure of expectations, the chaos of his emotions, the uncertainty of his future, flooding over him all at once. It was overwhelming, but there was something in Christian's steady presence that made him feel grounded. "I don't know how to do this," Maximilian admitted, his voice raw, vulnerable. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "You don't have to have all the answers," Christian said gently. "You just have to be willing to take the first step." Maximilian looked up at him, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, everything else faded away. The world outside, the weight of his father's expectations, the life he was supposed to lead. All that mattered was the quiet intensity between them. And then, without thinking, without the usual self-control, he took a step closer to Christian, his breath shallow as he closed the distance between them. Christian didn't move away. He didn't pull back. Instead, he stood there, waiting, as if giving Maximilian the space to make his choice. Maximilian hesitated for a moment, his heart racing, before he finally reached out. His hand brushed against Christian's, tentative at first, as if testing the waters. Christian's fingers curled around his, steady and warm. He felt something in him loosen, a shift that was both terrifying and liberating. "I'm not good at this," he murmured, his voice barely audible, his eyes searching Christian's. Christian's gaze softened, his thumb brushing across Maximilian's knuckles in a slow, reassuring motion. "You don't have to be," he said quietly. "You just have to be honest with yourself."